What's up guys, welcome back to InvestingPH. So today, I will show you what are the top dividend stocks in my watch list that I'm looking out to buy this year. Now when I look for dividend stocks, I don't just choose the highest dividend yielding stocks out there. What I'm looking for are dividend stocks that has strong financials and of course, has potential to grow more in the future. With this, I am sure the company can pay me dividends in the long run since I'm aiming to hold it for a very long time. Now, I have a video about the 5 dividend investing mistakes you should avoid, and I also have a book summary of the Little Book of Dividends. So if you still haven't watched these 2 videos, I suggest you watch it first. These are the things I follow when I'm looking for a dividend stock. Anyway, with that said, let's get on to the video. The first stock for today is LTG. Now, LTG's price had been in a constant roller coaster ride since last year. And for me, this roller coaster ride is a good thing since it goes down again, at which is a buying opportunity. Now, let's have a quick look at their financials. By the way, it's a good thing I still have my old data of LTG because app.ticker is already a paid website. That's the only website I know which shows 10 years worth of data. So for my future stock analysis, I'll go back to a 5-year data at which I get from Reuters.com. Still not bad. So comment down below if you know any website that shows 10 years worth of data and is for free. Going back, we can see total revenue had been growing consistently from 2014 onwards and a slight decline this pandemic season, which is normal for most companies here. As for their net income, same story, had a decline in 2020 and its latest 12 months. But if we factor out their latest 12-month, their 10-year growth average is at 15.01%, which is a good growth. And if we look at how well the company is converting revenue to net profit, we can see as the years goes by, their net margin is increasing. This COVID season was the only time they had a decrease. Increasing net profit margin may indicate that the company is becoming more efficient in their management in producing net profits from their revenue, which is a great sign. For their equity, consistent growth for the past 10 years. The only time they went stagnant was this pandemic. With this, they are growing at a compounded rate of 12.76%. And for their FCF, this is where things get a little bit complicated. As I've mentioned in my videos, LTG has a bank holding which is PNB, and this is one of their largest contributor in their financials. Now, banks usually have negative cash from operations because if we imagine how a bank operates, they lend money, they earn money through loans. This is reflected in their financials. That's why most banks have high debt ratios. This we can also see in LTG's debt to equity ratio. Again, don't be fooled by this exaggerated number for them. Since if you look at a bank's balance sheet, deposits are considered a liability, thus increasing this ratio for them. This is a normal ratio for banks. And as for their current ratio, they have a current ratio of 0.72, meaning they have 0.72 peso of current assets for every 1 peso of current liabilities. So not bad for a holding company with a bank holding. Next up, their dividends. Their dividend yield for 2021 is at 10.89%. So they even increased their dividends this year even amidst the pandemic. But let's not just concentrate on the yield alone. We also need to take into account their payout ratio, at which LTG has a payout ratio of 79%, meaning they are giving 79% of their net income to shareholders. Payout ratio is easy to compute. You just need the dividend per share annually divided by their EPS. Now, payout ratio tells us how sustainable their dividend payout is. So for LTG, they can easily maintain their dividends because even with their earnings decrease, they can still pay out this large amount. And remember, their EPS has also dropped this pandemic. If we use their pre-pandemic earnings for this payout ratio, this would only be 51% even with this dividend yield. For my buy price for LTG, still the same from the last time I evaluated this stock. My computed intrinsic value is 23.45. With a 30% margin of safety, my buy below price is at 16.41. Next up, GMA7. With ABS-CBN off the list, it no longer has a good competitor in its field, and they've recovered quite well from their stagnant years. A quick look at their financials, we can see there weren't any growth from 2016 to 2019. By the way, the reading is from right to left again, since this is the format of Reuters. Now for 2020, they've managed to grow quite well. In their net income, same story. With their growth in 2020, this offsets their stagnant years. having a compounded growth rate in the past 5 years by 10.54%. And if you look at their net income margin, we can see why their net income has risen quite well. Their profit margin for 2020 really increased. Their usual profit margin is at 15 to 20%. So let's see if they can continue this in the upcoming years. As for their equity, same story as their revenue and net income, stagnant from 2016 to 2019 and a sudden growth in 2020. With this, their compounded average growth rate is only at 4.24% in the last 5 years, so not that high. Now, I would like to point out as well is their high ROE, and this isn't only for 2020 alone. This had been consistent from 2016 to 2020. Their 5-year ROE average is at 32.03%, which is really high. Now, ROE tells us how well the company is using their equity to produce net profits. This is one thing to take note on GMA7. For their FCF, we can see since 2016, this is in a decline, but on the brighter side, it's still in the positive line. Now, this decline isn't much of a big deal for me when I look at GMA, since again, their FCF is still positive. And if you look at their debt ratios, their debt to equity is only at 0.87, which is really low. This means they only have 0.87 peso of debt for every 1 peso of equity. And as for their current ratio, a good one as well, which is at 2.89, meaning they have 2.89 peso of current assets for every 1 peso of current liabilities. So both debt ratios are well handled. And I would just want to point out as well, GMA has no long-term debt. For their dividends, as we've seen a while ago in their net income, it had been stagnant in 2016 to 2019, at which we can also see in their dividend payout. 2016 to 2020 was in a decline, but this really improved in 2021, at which now has a dividend yield of 9.64%. Now let's check if they can maintain this percentage. They have a payout ratio of 96%, so really high. This means the company may be giving most of their net income to shareholders and only a few are left to reinvest back to grow the company. So this is the only thing I don't like in GMA. Although even if they lowered their dividend payout ratio, their dividend yield would still be high, still exceeding 5%. But let's see in the upcoming years if they can maintain this one. But again, even if they lowered it, their dividend yield would still be above the average yield, and the company has a very well-handled debt on top of that. And as for my buy price, my computed intrinsic value for them is at 17.27. With a 30% margin of safety, my buy below price is at 12.16. So the current price right now is higher than my buy below price. But if you're in it for the dividends, then it's not a bad deal even for the price right now. But for me, it's okay to wait. Next up, AUB. Although most bank stocks don't have a high dividend yield, but since their price was cut down this pandemic, this increased most of their yield. A quick look at their financials. Now I look at banks' financial differently compared to other industries. First, I look at their net interest income and non-interest income. What I like here is for the main bulk of the bank's earnings should be from their net interest income, because this is much more stable and secured since these are from the loans. With this, if we add these two up, we get the revenue before loan provision, at which I also put side to side with the revenue. This gives us a clue what happened this COVID season, wherein banks had a massive drop in their net income because most banks had a high provision to keep them secured for the loans that wouldn't be paid out to them. As you can see in 2020, although net interest income and non-interest income went up massively as seen in the revenue before provision, they set aside a larger provision, making their revenue go down. This can be seen clearly in their net income, just like what LTG is showing to us a while ago, since most of their income comes from their bank holding. But even with AUB's negative growth, their net income growth rate for the past 10 years is at 13.39%. For their total equity, AUB is consistent in their growth, growing at a compounded rate of 15.33% for the past 10 years, which is really great for them. Another thing I look at for banks is their loan-to-debt ratio. This tells us how liquid the bank is. This compares the total deposit in the bank to the loans they give out. So with this, we don't want a bank that gives out all their money for loans, because what if there's a major fund requirement for them, then they don't have enough money to back it up since they put it all for loans. Usually, the typical for this is at least 80 to 90%, since a lower number can indicate the bank isn't maximizing its available money, thus leading them to earn less. But again, AUB is now at 71% this pandemic season, which is a good move for them, since like we've seen this pandemic, a lot of businesses may not be able to pay out loans. That's why most banks have lowered their loan-to-debt ratios. Next up, their price-to-book ratio. This for me is a much better way to assess banks rather than the PE ratio. With this, we can see AUB's price is lower compared to its competitors. A price-to-book ratio less than 1 indicates AUB is priced less than the total value of its assets. Now for their dividends, for a bank company, they aren't left behind. They have a dividend yield of 4.49%, and since 2017, they have grown their dividends every year, except for 2021 wherein they paid the same amount as 2020. But what I also like about this is I know they can maintain this dividend payout because their payout ratio is only at 44%. This is even with the drop in their earnings, take note. Plus their strong financials, this also helps to know they can maintain this payout. For my buy price, still the same, my computed intrinsic value for them is at 68.08. Having a 30% margin of safety, my buy below price is at 48.21. So this is why their dividend yield also increased because of the drop in price. And we can also see that in their price to book ratio, which tells us that this company is really undervalued. Next is DMCI. Now some have asked me, if I'm into dividends, why don't I have Semirara Mining or SCC at hand? Well, I don't like their business since it's about coal, and I also have DMC in my portfolio already, at which owns Semirara as well. I love the other holdings of DMC, at which I explained in my stock analysis of it. The only holding of them I don't like is their stake at SCC. Anyway, a quick look of their financials. We can see they had been consistent in growing their revenue for the past 10 years, and the only drop was in 2020 or this pandemic. But in their latest 12 months, they have already recovered and has actually grown more than their pre-pandemic numbers. As for their net income, same story. There are some sudden spikes in growth like in 2013. This sometimes happen in a company. That's why never look at a company in just a 2 or 3 year span, because these events can happen. Anyway, 2019 and 2020 was a huge decrease, but again, they have already recovered their pre-pandemic numbers in their latest 12 months, which then gives us a compounded average growth rate of 7.77% in the past 10 years. For their equity, same as well, consistent growth every year, except for that tiny drop in 2020. With this, they have a compounded growth rate of 13.06% in the past 10 years. And for their free cash flow, there are only some years that they had a negative FCF. And for their latest 12 months, they've also recovered that drop in 2020. As for how they are handling their debt to equity ratio is at 1.50, meaning they have 1.50 peso of debt for every 1 peso of equity. So well within the norm for typical companies. And for their current ratio, they have a current ratio of 2.31. So they have 2.31 peso of current assets for every 1 peso of current liabilities. Now for their dividends, now this company has been a very good dividend paying stock. They have increased or maintained their dividends since 2017, and in some years, they pay out special dividends, like for last year, which really increased their dividend yield. So for those who bought DMC during the peak of its drop during the pandemic, has really felt that massive payout. Even though its price right now has increased quite a bit, their dividend yield in 2021 was 11.79%. Now, even if you remove their special dividends, their dividend yield would still be more than 5%. As to how sustainable their dividends, their payout ratio is at 82.7%. Now, although it's at the 80%, remember, this is even with those special dividends. In their other years, they only have a range of 50 to 60% dividend payout. For my buy price for them, my intrinsic value is at 11.40. Having a 30% margin of safety, my buy below price is at 8.02. So right now, DMC is slightly above this price, but like in the past few weeks, there was a lot of buying opportunity for it. Last on our list for today is Meralco. Now I added this one since Meralco is I think one of the most stable companies. Since this is the largest electric distributor in our country, their business is really a necessity. So if you are aiming solely for dividends, this is also a good choice, but again, at least pay a good price for it. Now I only have 5 years worth of data for this one as well. So for 2016 to 2020, the only drop in their growth is in 2020, which is normal, and their net income tells us the same story. Because of the drop in 2020, their 5-year average compounded growth rate is still at the negative. But for pre-pandemic numbers, they had been growing at a compounded growth rate of 5% in the past 4 years, so quite small compared to the other companies we evaluated. So just imagine the business of Meralco. It isn't that easy to grow in a large scale compared to other companies, and they are already a large business to start with. For me, this is quite the normal growth for them. Now for their net income margin, they are consistent in the 7.4 to 7.7%. The only time it went down was in 2020. For their equity, almost the same. 2020 was a drop for them. Now most power companies had the same story as well. If you want to watch my stock analysis of other power companies, there's a link below. But remember, Meralco is focused on power distribution, not power generation. As for their FCF, since 2016, they never had a negative year. And of course, 2020 as well is another big drop for them. So power companies was really affected by the pandemic since because of the work at home, so business establishments weren't used that much. This led to lower power consumption since establishments, buildings are the big contributor for their income. This is the reason why most power companies had a huge drop in 2020. For their debt ratios, Meralco's debt to equity ratio is at 3.93, so quite high, and in comparison with other power companies, they have the highest. Now is this alarming? Well, this would be if the company doesn't generate a good amount of cash flow. As for Meralco's case, we can see they are quite consistent in their revenue. The only time they went down was during the pandemic. And for their current ratio, it is at 0.90. So they have 0.90 peso of current assets for every 1 peso of current liabilities. So not quite what we want. Compared to other companies in the power sector, they have the lowest. Now, this is the only negative side of Meralco since their debt ratios are quite off. But you have to take note as well that their line of business is something everyone needs. They have a sure customer. Power is the lifeline of the country. Although yes, they have a high debt ratio, but for me, they can manage this quite well since their cash flow is consistent. Now for their dividends, they have a yield of 6.74% in 2021, and they are consistent in their payout per year. Although there are some fluctuations, their yield is still high. And for their payout ratio, they have a ratio of 67%. This is even with the drop of their earnings this 2020. So with the line of business of Meralco, their cash flow is consistent. They can easily maintain their dividend payout. As for my buy price for them, my computed intrinsic value is at 358. With a 30% margin of safety, I have a buy below price of 251. So with that, this ends this video for today. Now although some of these stocks are beyond my buy below price, and yes, waiting can cause me to miss out on some, but it's okay. There are still some stocks out there that are still undervalued that gives me a good amount of dividends. Some are asking me why don't I have this stock or this certain stock? Well, to answer that, I don't just focus solely on dividends. It has to be in complement with my checklist, and it has to be in the right price for me. And of course, it also has to be in my circle of competence. I don't just buy and buy stocks based on dividend yield. Like for these companies I mentioned, although I like them, I'm still waiting for a good moment to buy them. I won't compromise my checklist for dividend yield alone. And I also invest in companies whom doesn't give out large number of dividends. That's why my strategy is a combination of dividend investing, value investing, and passive investing as well. I don't just focus on one strategy alone. Anyway, I explained this in some of my videos, so I suggest you watch as well my other videos to learn more about it. And before you leave, be sure to hit the like button first, and if you still aren't subscribed yet, might as well hit the subscribe button as well. So thank you and see you in the next video.